Chapter 16. Revelation in Flames. William took a moment to steady his nerves, for now he'd somehow been able to quell his tears. As he started to ground himself, his mind went back to what Eric had just said as he'd been comforting him. "Uncle Wilton was here this morning. Did he say anything about Sasha?" asked William. "Aye, he said that Sasha is okay. They don't believe her story about Anne-Marie, though," explained Eric. William let out a sigh and leaned back in his chair, immediately jumping forward again when his brand touched the wood. "I've got to go up there and explain what happened," he said, standing from his chair. "William, no. Think about it," reasoned Eric, also standing. William stared back at him expectantly as panic coursed through his veins. "What are they going to think? Are they going to believe that a monster that looked like Anne-Marie came and started murdering your family?" asked Eric expectantly. "Well, it's the truth," replied William defensively. "Aye, it is. But what's more likely? Your pa was the largest man in the village, and there ain't a soul who don't know that he were a bully. People have always gossiped about him working you and your sister too hard. Is it really that much of a stretch that maybe big old Steinar Lackdorian were beating his wife?" asked Eric. William stared back at him in horror. "Eric, what are ye on about?" yelled William furiously. Eric shook his head. "William, think about it from their perspective. You said your ma was strangled. Your sister has already told them that it was your pa that did it. It won't take a genius to see that it were his hands around her neck. What if little Sasha Lackdorian were trying to protect her brother from being hung for patricide? What if that's why she made up her ghost stories?" asked Eric. William couldn't hold back his anger. He groaned loudly in rage and slammed his fist down on the table, almost waking Barty from his drunken slumber. "William, calm down for a second," cried Eric. "How can you speak about my family like that?" yelled William. "Come on, William. You know I love your family, but please be realistic with me for a second here," begged Eric desperately. "What good is you going back to that village going to do? All you'd be doing is putting your life in jeopardy, and for no good reason," explained Eric, trying to appeal to William logically. William let out a frustrated groan. "What about my father's honor? He loved me, Ma. He'd never have laid a hand on her. Never!" cried William, tears streaming down his face. "I know that. And if you don't go back to that village, what happened in that house last night will remain a mystery. Nobody will know. They won't know where William Lackdorian went. They won't know what happened to your parents. All they'll know is that it were a tragedy that broke your sister's young mind," said Eric, shaking his head sadly. William stared back at Eric, earnestly taking in his words. He was right. The only thing that going back to Lackdorian would achieve was putting William's life in danger. He had no evidence, as the monster was gone. All he had was a disgusting wound on his back and a ghost story. He groaned in frustration. "I can't stay here forever. What am I supposed to do?" asked William, goosebumps appearing on his arms as the futility of his situation dawned on him. "William, I have a plan. I ain't leaving you. You hear me?" asked Eric, looking into William's eyes searchingly. William nodded appreciatively. "What's your plan?" asked William quietly. Eric stood up and put his hands on his hips. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "There's only one place that the forbidden knowledge we need can be found. We're going to Oxgate," he said definitively. William rolled his eyes. "Eric, we've been over this. We can't get into that library. We'd have to be—" began William. "Aye, we'd have to be knights," interrupted Eric. William stared back at him blankly for a moment. "Have ye forgotten something? We're a couple of farm boys, Eric. We're not nobles. They don't let people like us become knights," said William, shaking his head dismissively. Eric raised an eyebrow and looked down at William haughtily. "No, William, you're the one who's forgotten something. I may be a farm boy, but I'm also a Rothmane," said Eric. "Wait," began William, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. "I, William, my great-grandfather may have chosen to live out his last days on this farmland, but it didn't make him any less of a noble," said Eric, shaking his head. William's eyes widened as he stared at Eric. You're a noble," said William in awe. "Aye, William, so get your things ready. We're going to Oxgate," said Eric. "You don't have to do this, you know," said William, feeling guilty as he watched his friend turning his life upside down to help him. Eric finished tightening the last strap around one of the packs before he stood up and dusted his hands off triumphantly. "I know, but ye can't talk me out of it now, brother," he replied with a wink before turning around and heading back inside to collect his final items. William looked over the tightly packed cart and let out a guilty sigh. A loud crash suddenly erupted from inside Eric's house, pulling him from his thoughts. He hurried to the front door, but stopped in his tracks when he realized what had caused the ruckus. "What do you think you're doing?" exclaimed Barty, who had woken from his nap just as drunk as when he'd entered it. The crash had been the sound of him stumbling into a kitchen shelf, knocking down some pots and pans. Eric stood on the other side of the living room, rifling through a small chest that had been hidden behind some books. "Father, I'm leaving," said Eric flatly, taking the contents of the small chest and pouring it into a coin purse. "Get your filthy hands out of my money," shouted Barty drunkenly, trying feebly to right himself and falling over in the opposite direction into the kitchen table this time. "I'd wager you didn't know I was keeping this chest of savings," said Eric, his eyes glazing over as he stared at his drunken father, unable to right himself. "If you'd known, it'd all be gone by now," finished Eric, closing the chest and putting it back where he'd found it. "Give me my money, you fat pig," shouted his father, still unable to let go of the kitchen table that he was clinging to desperately for support. Eric shook his head in disdain. "I'm going to Oxgate to become a knight," said Eric, turning and looking up at a portrait of his great-grandfather which hung on the wall. Barty released a howling cackle of laughter in response. "You? A knight? What are you going to do? Eat them to death?" exclaimed Barty, his laughter turning into a coughing fit, followed by some dry gagging. "It's what Granda would have wanted for me," said Eric honestly. Eric's father managed to catch his breath, standing up shakily and pointing a finger towards Eric threateningly. "You don't have the balls to be a knight, you ungrateful tyke," spat his father furiously, taking his first drunken, stumbling step towards Eric without the table's support. "Now give me my money, or I'll turn your face upside down, you great fat," Barty slurred, taking another shaky step towards Eric before stumbling into one of the kitchen chairs and falling down to the floor. Eric took a few steps towards his father and looked down over him, flailing about on the kitchen floor. "I'm only taking the savings I've set aside since I took over control of the farm. I'm leaving the rest for you. It'll be more than enough to keep the farm running, as long as you don't drink it all away," said Eric, looking down over his drunken father. "You wouldn't dare! I'll smash your face in! Come here!" cried Barty from the kitchen floor. Eric shook his head. "If Mother could see you now," said Eric, furrowing his brow with disdain. "Don't you dare speak about her," said Barty, pointing a finger up at his son. "Don't you dare!" he yelled at the top of his lungs, inciting another hacking coughing fit. Eric hesitated for a moment, clearly wanting to help his father up. He eventually seemed to change his mind and took a step away. He took a few more tentative steps towards the front door before he turned around and looked back at his father. "I really am leaving, Father. I trust you remember how to run this place," said Eric as Barty flailed about, trying to sit upright. He paused for another moment. "I love you, Pa. I really hope you find your way out of this nonsense. I'll come back and visit you someday, and I hope when I do I can make you proud," said Eric, his expression darkening. He closed his eyes for a moment and turned away. "Proud?" yelled Barty. Proud! You've never made me proud a day in your good-for-nothing life, you hear me? You're dead to me, boy! Dead! Bellowed Barty, sitting upright and pointing at Eric. William wasn't sure what to do. He'd never felt so awkward in his life. "Come on, Will," said Eric, nodding to William as he walked towards the door. "Oh," said Eric, suddenly stopping and turning back towards his father. "If you've any decency left in you at all, you won't tell anybody that William was here," said Eric, nodding to his father one last time before walking out the door. "You're dead to me, boy. If you come back here, I'll kill you. Do you hear me, boy? I'll kill you," screamed Barty from the kitchen floor. William followed Eric silently out the door and out towards the cart. "You okay?" asked William once they reached the cart. "Aye," said Eric, closing his eyes and nodding his head. "It's like I said. At least I've still got him," he said before hopping up onto the cart. William nodded understandingly and hopped up into the cart onto the seat beside Eric. "Nope," said Eric suddenly, shaking his head. William looked around in confusion. "You need to rest. Hop in the back," said Eric, nodding over his shoulder. "Oh, come on! After all you've done today, surely you should be the one resting," argued William. "You don't even know where we're going," retorted Eric, cracking a wry smile. William crossed his arms and released a groan in defeat. "Fine, I'll just rest for a short while. Wake me up before dusk," demanded William as he crawled painfully over into the back of the cart. "Aye, aye," said Eric with a smile. William tried lying down on his side, but on the bumpy road his back simply hurt far too much. With a grunt, he adjusted to lying uncomfortably on his stomach. He couldn't imagine that he'd be able to fall asleep while lying on his stomach in the back of a bumpy cart anyway, so he really would only rest his eyes for a short while. It took less than a minute for William to fall into a deep sleep. William was woken with a jolt. The wagon seemed to be bumping even more heavily than he imagined it would. As he sat up on his hands and knees, he noticed that dusk had already fallen over the moors. "Hey!" exclaimed William. "Oh, you're awake," said Eric cheerfully. "I told you to wake me up before dusk fell," said William, leaning his head on the back of Eric's seat and groaning with pain as his brand wound was stretched by his motion. "Whoops," said Eric, chuckling to himself. William looked around them and immediately realized why the wagon had been bumping more than before. They had turned off of the main dirt road through the moors and were traversing a rough, rocky path up a heather-laden hill. "Hey, where are we going?" asked William, looking around at the endless fields of heather stretching all around them. "I know some people that live out here. They'll let us stay in their commune overnight, trust me," said Eric with a confident nod. William inspected their barren surroundings curiously. Sure, there were a lot of hills, but William supposed that there couldn't possibly be any towns around here. As it were, he could see no signs of settlement. They live out here?" asked William, confused. Eric gave him a sly look out of the corner of his eye as they neared the top of the small hill that they were travelling up. Atop a slightly smaller hill just beyond this one sat a congregation of colourful tents. "Gypsies," thought William aloud in awe as they continued towards the encampment. Eric gave him a knowing nod in response. It only took the boys a few more minutes to arrive at the camp right as night was falling. Upon their arrival, several people congregated over to inspect the boys mysteriously arriving at their camp. "Good evening," called out Eric as they approached. The gypsies were reticent at first, but upon realizing that it was Eric, immediately lightened up and waved back. "Young Eric, it's good to see you, my boy," called out one of the men enthusiastically. As soon as he reached the camp, Eric pulled Bonnie to a halt and hopped down from the cart, exchanging greetings with the gypsies. He suddenly turned around and gestured towards William. "This is my friend William from Lacdorian," announced Eric. Everybody waved merrily to him and welcomed him into their camp. William felt himself blushing as the attention was turned on him, waving back and smiling awkwardly. "What brings you to our camp?" asked one of the older gentlemen curiously. "Aye, you aren't due for another week, are you, son?" asked one of the gypsy ladies, looking at him with concern. Eric let out a sigh and nodded. "You're right, I'm not, but next time it'll be my pa bringing your delivery," replied Eric. A few of them exchanged surprised looks. "Are you sure he's up to it?" asked the lady. "Aye, I believe he is." Eric nodded confidently. "Well then, what brings you boys to our camp then?" asked the older gentleman again. "Now that is a long story, but we're here requesting that we stay with you just for the night. We're travelling to Oxgate, and we need a place to rest," explained Eric, bowing his head politely. The gypsies exchanged some unsure glances with each other. "Oh, right," said Eric, turning towards William. "Pass down that green sack in the corner, would you, Will?" asked Eric. William scrambled to find what he was talking about. Once he found it, he passed it down to Eric, who received it eagerly. "I've brought a gift, some fresh pork," said Eric happily. Immediately the gypsies' faces brightened up. "Well then, what are you waiting for, boys? Come in, I'll get a campfire started," said one of the gypsies excitedly as the whole group spurred into action. William smiled and shook his head in surprise. Eric had really planned ahead. Would William ever be able to think as clearly as Eric always did? He didn't have much time to ponder this, as the gypsies suddenly came over and led Bonnie and the cart into their campsite. The atmosphere around the campfire was extremely jovial. It was a much-needed distraction from the grim adventure that William and Eric had been sharing. After they'd all had their fill of pork, a few of the gypsies had taken to playing music by some lanterns a short way away from the fire. Coming from Lackdorian, William had never had a lot of exposure to music. Only on winter solstice night or when travelling gypsies had come through town on occasion. There were 4 gypsies playing instruments, one a fiddle, another a lute, one a flute, and finally one with a small animal skin drum. As they played their enchanting music, William was positively captivated. A gypsy lady in a beautiful red dress was dancing to their music in the firelight, her skirt spiralling all around, rendering William spellbound. This was exactly the kind of distraction he and Eric needed. He turned to his friend to see how he was enjoying the music, but found him fast asleep on the floor by the campfire. He smiled, happy to see him finally lying down. It was a well-earned rest. "So, William, is it?" asked the elderly gypsy who was sitting by the campfire beside William. "Aye," stammered William with a nod. The gypsy smiled at him politely before casting a curious gaze down to his clothing and raising an eyebrow. "My boy, that tunic is far too large for you," said the old man, shaking his head as he regarded the tunic, which was indeed several sizes too large for William. "Aye, it's one of his," William laughed, nodding towards Eric, who was fast asleep. The gypsy nodded understandingly. "Melina!" shouted out the old man suddenly, taking William by surprise. After a few moments, a middle-aged gypsy lady came out from one of the nearby tents. "Aye, father?" she asked. "Please find a tunic for young William here," asked the old man, catching William off guard. "Oh, no, that's okay. I'm perfectly comfortable," lied William in his giant tunic, which went down over his knees. The gypsy lady raised an eyebrow at him before turning around and disappearing into one of the tents. "Please, you really don't have to trouble yourself," insisted William after her, feeling overwhelming shame at taking advantage of these gypsies' hospitality. After a few moments the lady came back out, holding a vibrant green tunic. "Really, I'm fine," insisted William. "Try this one on," she said, ignoring him. He finally obliged, but when he removed his oversized tunic, both of the gypsies gasped in shock. "My boy, what has happened to you?" exclaimed the elderly man, looking at William's extensive bandaging. William blushed abashedly. "I had an accident," lied William, not sure of what kind of excuse to use. The two gypsies exchanged concerned looks with one another. "When did this happen, dear?" asked the gypsy lady, walking closer into the campfire light beside Will to look at his bandages. When the two were face to face in the light, for a moment they both paused and curiously inspected one another. "Wait a minute, don't I know you from somewhere?" asked the lady, tilting her head curiously. William felt like he recognized her too, but he wasn't quite sure where from, before suddenly it hit him. She was one of the healers that had been unable to help Anne-Marie. He'd talked with her briefly outside Anne-Marie's window. It felt like that had all happened an eternity ago at this point. In reality, it had only been a little over a week ago. William leaned back nervously. I don't think so," he lied. He looked down at Eric, who was still fast asleep. Just how much trouble was William going to get himself into while Eric couldn't do the talking for him? Suddenly, the gypsy lady's eyes opened wide and she gasped. "You're the boy! The stable boy! Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry," she said, extending her arms to embrace him, but then realizing there was no real way to hug him, so simply laid a concerned hand on his cheek. "I heard what happened to her, my love. I'm so sorry," she said again, rubbing his cheek gently. William felt tears well in his eyes. He couldn't cry. Not in front of these strangers, not now. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't quite quell the tears, though. Why was he crying? Was it just because of her motherly warmth? Was it because she had mentioned Anne-Marie? He wasn't sure. Something about how she'd tried to console him opened the fresh wounds in his heart, and suddenly he felt tears falling from his eyes that he couldn't stop. Thank you," said William, desperately wiping at his tears. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, son?" asked the elderly man. William nodded, continuing to wipe away the tears that were rolling down his cheeks. The two gypsies exchanged concerned glances with one another. "Son, why don't you let her take a look at that wound of yours?" asked the elderly man suddenly. William shook his head as a feeling of panic ran down his spine. "No, it's okay, I'm fine, really," said William, again looking down at Eric, who was still fast asleep. He reached down towards the large tunic that he'd already pulled off, wanting to put it back on, but the gypsy lady grabbed his arm. "I'm a healer. Please, let me help you," she implored, staring into his eyes with concern. William wavered for a second. Would it really be that big of a deal if she looked at the wound? As William hesitated, the gypsy lady led him over to a tree stump that was by the elderly man. Come," she said, leading him by the hand to sit down. Before William could even think, she'd started unwrapping his bandages. "What kind of accident did you have?" asked the old man, watching on curiously. William tried to slow his rapidly beating heart while he thought of an excuse. It was, stammered William, not sure of what kind of excuse he could even use. As soon as the gypsy lady set eyes on the wounds, she immediately gasped. "What in the world is this?" she exclaimed in horror, her confusion and worry intensifying with every layer of bandage she unwrapped. There was no excuse William could even come up with at this point. As the bandages were unwrapped, revealing the extent of his wounds, all William could do was wince in pain and try his best to angle his burn wounds away from the campfire. As he turned his head, he suddenly caught sight of the elderly gypsy. The old man's eyes and mouth were open wide with an expression of horror on his face. He looked over at Eric again, desperate for someone to help him out of this awkward situation, but he was still in a deep sleep. The gypsy lady looked at her father with concern. He knew that his wounds were shocking, but he'd not been able to see them himself as they were on his back. Just how bad was it? "My boy, who has done this to you?" asked the old man, crawling towards him and inspecting the sigil more closely. Upon taking a closer look, the old man fell backwards in shock. "Father, what is it?" asked the gypsy lady suddenly, placing a concerned hand on her father's arm. He was visibly shaking with fear. William knew that the wounds were confronting, but this reaction was very extreme. It was a level of fear that a mere wound shouldn't instill in somebody. "This is dark magic," said the man, scrambling a little bit further away from William. His daughter ran over to her father and put an arm around him to comfort him. "What do you mean?" she asked, looking over at the sigil on William's back. The man was positively shaking with fear at this point. "The boy. He wears the language of the gateway on his skin," said the old man, tears of fear falling from his eyes. William felt his heartbeat racing as a chill ran down his spine. The language of the gateway? Just what had he and Eric done? What really was this mysterious sigil, and what kind of mistake had they made in using it? Chapter 17. The Keeper of the Key. The old man stared at William, taking a shaky deep breath and pulling the blanket his daughter had given him tighter over his shoulders. The mere sight of William's wound hadn't been what scared him. It was the sigil itself. "For something so evil to be branded into the flesh of a child," muttered the old man, shaking his head in disbelief. His tanned skin had paled since setting sight on the mark. William hadn't said a word. He didn't know what was even appropriate to say at a time like this. He had many questions, but he didn't know which to ask first. "Please help the boy and then cover it. Such a thing should not be out in the open like this. It's not safe," said the old man. The lady rifled around in a satchel that was leaning against the side of a tent before withdrawing a mortar and pestle. She then withdrew a bag of herbs and walked over towards William. "What's that?" asked William apprehensively. "This one," began the woman, holding up one handful of herbs. "It relieves pain. It'll help to numb the wound so that it won't give you so much trouble while it's healing," she explained, placing it into the mortar. "This one," she said again, holding up a different kind of herb. "Will help the wound to heal," she continued, also placing that into the mortar. "And this one," she said finally, holding up a third kind of herb. "This one will help to keep the wound free of infection," she finished, adding that into the mortar too. William nodded, swallowing nervously as he anticipated how much it may hurt to apply these to his wound. The gypsy lady immediately got to work, bashing and muddling the herbs together with the pestle until they'd formed a thick paste. "Why didn't you give any of these to Anne-Marie?" asked William, his expression darkening as he remembered back to that fateful day. The woman's bashing slowed and she let out a mournful sigh. "My boy, what was wrong with her went far too deep for such ointments to help. Even the medicines of Oxgate's finest apothecaries couldn't have helped her," said the lady, shaking her head. "The Lacdorian girl," said the old man suddenly, as he finally realized who they were talking about. "Aye," confirmed William. The old man nodded in realization. "That's where this all started, isn't it, boy?" he asked. William nodded solemnly in confirmation. The old man closed his eyes and mulled over the situation for a moment. "So, was it the cleric's baby after all?" asked the lady, returning to bashing and muddling the herbs. William nodded again. The lady shared a concerned look with her father. "As I suspected, this sigil does hearken back to that cursed gateway," said the old man, shaking his head with disdain. William regarded him quizzically. "No, sir, the brand on my back is not from the gate. It was upon a relic, a shield from the Great War. We used it to protect us from—" Well, William realized he'd said too much. He didn't want to come off as crazy. He remembered Eric's warnings about how saying too much could lead to him being hanged for patricide. He had to be more careful with his words. The man's eyes suddenly widened again. "A shield from the Great War? There's only one thing this evil mark could be used to protect against. "Oh, my child, what dangers have you brought to our camp?" asked the old man, suddenly looking over his shoulder anxiously. William stammered for the right words to defend himself. "No, sir, please, don't get me wrong. What I was running from is gone. This mark saved my life," said William honestly. The old man shared another concerned look with his daughter. "Do you see now, Melina? This is why the kingdom forbids knowledge of these things. It is not safe," said the old man, shaking his head disdainfully. "Get ready, boy, this will hurt a little," said the lady suddenly, preparing to apply the ointment to William's wound. He couldn't help but groan as the searing pain erupted once again as she applied her ointment. "If you're not running from something, then what's sending you to Oxgate?" asked the old man curiously. William let out a sigh. "As you say, the knowledge we need is forbidden. Oxgate is the only place that we can find it. We're looking for answers. We still don't know what really happened in Lacdorian. We don't know what was really chasing me. All I know is that my loved ones are dead, and I should be too. He's the only reason I'm still alive," said William, pointing to Eric, who was still fast asleep. The old man nodded understandingly. "If it's answers that you're seeking, perhaps I can help a little," said the old man, causing William to snap his head around in surprise. Upon seeing William's enthusiasm, the old man held up his hands. "I don't know much, but I can share what I know about that cursed mark," said the old man. William nodded patiently. "When I was a child, our people still hadn't yet found their place in these western lands. After the war, we had wanted to return to our homeland. Upon arriving there, we discovered that the war was in reality still far from over. Those creatures from the gateway, my parents used to say that they're drawn to arid, empty places. Nowhere is drier than our homeland in the eastern deserts. I was lucky enough not to see them, but the knights out there told us that it was still too unsafe for our people to return home. Even with the gateway closed, the monsters which still lingered here wandered the desert, lusting for a way for their vile brethren to join them. The desert which we called home was the very same desert in which that cursed gateway was opened. When my family returned there, they hadn't finished building that monastery around the gateway yet, so I was able to see it with my own 2 eyes. The old man suddenly trailed off as he ruminated on his harrowing childhood experiences. William waited patiently for the man to recompose himself while the lady began rebandaging his wounds. "Upon the rocks which make up the gate, a message is engraved, a message in a language not of our world. It is through this language that the gateway was opened and the monsters spilled forth. It is this very same language which you have branded into your flesh," said the old man chillingly. William felt the hairs on his arms raise as goosebumps ran down his whole body. How were he and Eric supposed to have known any of this? Something suddenly occurred to William, a symbol over which monsters of the gate can't traverse. How had he never realized it until this moment? Clearly this is magic. "Wait, does that mean that I've practiced witchcraft?" asked William, suddenly gulping as realization dawned on him. Not only had he committed patricide, he'd also somehow managed to commit the single other most deadly sin that their society condemned. The old man let out a sigh. "The boys didn't know. Surely it can't be considered real witchcraft," insisted the man's daughter, sliding the fresh tunic over William's shoulders now that his wound had been attended to. The old man once again shook his head solemnly. "I'm afraid that by the sounds of things, whatever it is that these boys have been involved in goes far deeper than mere witchcraft," said the old man chillingly. There was a moment of silence as the 3 of them wallowed in the severity of the situation, while the wildly juxtaposed, cheery music carried on in the background. The lady placed a concerned hand on William's shoulder again. "My boy, you can stay here tonight, but—" began the lady. William held up his hand. "Trust me, I understand. "We'll be gone as soon as the sun rises," said William solemnly. The trail of destruction in their wake was so dark and harrowing that William couldn't blame them. He wouldn't feel comfortable being involved in it either. The old man stood up from his stump and looked at William compassionately. "May your curse be broken, my son. May these deadly omens be mere coincidence. May the gateway remain forever closed," he said with a nod, before turning away and retiring into a tent. William stared despondently at his back as he left. He had learned a lot more about his situation, but it had only made him feel even more helpless. "I too must sleep now," said the lady, packing her satchel back up. "Thank you for tending to my wound," said William earnestly. She smiled and nodded politely in response. "What can I do to repay you?" he asked, unsure of what he even had to give. The lady let out a sigh. "To repay me? Please, just never return to our camp," she said earnestly, with an expression of concern on her face. William swallowed, unsure of exactly how to respond to her. He nodded somberly, relieved that despite the harsh sentiment, it was a payment he could actually afford. "Aye," he replied simply. With that, she too retired to her tent. William lowered himself down from the stump that he'd been sitting on and sat down on the floor by Eric. So once again, Eric had been right. It all harkened back to the gateway after all. There were a million questions that William had spinning in his mind, but at this point he was too overwhelmed to even know where to begin. As he lay down on his side, watching the embers dancing in the night, his eyelids slowly closed and he drifted off into a deep, deep sleep. Tap, tap, tap. William shot up straight in his bed. As he looked around his room, he found himself barely able to see anything. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear his vision. When he opened them again, he still found himself struggling to see things clearly. It was as though his whole room was swirling around like he was drunk. Tap, tap, tap. William gasped with surprise. Anne-Marie was knocking at his wardrobe door. How long had he been asleep? He tried to remember what he'd been dreaming about, but couldn't recall anything. He definitely got the vibe that it had been a nightmare, though. Tap, tap, tap. "Aye, I'm coming," called out William enthusiastically, trying to stay steady on his feet in his swirling world. He took a few shaky steps towards the wardrobe before suddenly stopping on the spot. He felt like he'd forgotten something really important. For a moment he simply stood still, trying his hardest to remember what it was. No matter how hard he strained himself, though, he couldn't remember. He shook his head and continued towards the wardrobe, reaching out and grabbing the handle. As soon as he tried to pull on it, he realized that something was wrong. No matter how hard he pulled, the door remained closed. "William," whispered Anne-Marie from inside the wardrobe. "Aye, I'm here," he called back breathlessly. "I'm locked in here, William," she whispered again shakily. William felt his heart sink. How had Anne-Marie managed to get locked inside his wardrobe? What would happen if his parents found out that she was in his room? Wait, his parents? Suddenly, horrific images from his memories flashed before his eyes. His mother's mottled face as she struggled for air, his father's final death rattle as he bled out on the floor. William screamed and clutched his head as the horrific memories flooded over his mind. "William!" yelled Anne-Marie angrily from in the wardrobe, banging on the door from within. He fell to his knees, the images haunting his mind, beginning to overwhelm him. "Let me out! Let me out!" screamed Anne-Marie desperately, shaking the wardrobe furiously all the while. Eric was woken from his slumber, feeling a burning sensation on his thigh like he'd rolled over onto a hot coal. He rolled away from the campfire and onto his other side before he suddenly heard William murmuring in his sleep. "Mother, father," murmured William. Eric's heart sank as he realized the trauma his friend was dealing with. He opened his eyes to check up on him, but as soon as he did, he felt his heart leap up into his throat. There, looming over William in the darkness, were 6 enormous moor-crawlers. Eric caught himself before he instinctively cried out in fright, placing his hand over his mouth just in time. All of them were slowly creeping closer to William, inspecting him curiously as he slept. Their empty, expressionless, human-like faces and bald heads were craned down as they studied him. They tilted their heads around like puppies hearing a new sound for the first time. Eric tentatively shuffled backwards, slightly away from William, but felt his back bump against something. He slowly turned his head and noticed that there was another moor-crawler right over his shoulder. His heart began racing and his body began hyperventilating and shaking as the reality of the situation set in. The moor-crawlers varied in size from 5 feet to well over 7. They all had the same distinctive features. Grey skin which extended down each of their 6 arms, each ending in human-like hands upon which they walked through the moors. Hair like that on a man's arms sprouted from every inch of their grey bodies, which slinked closer to William by the second. As Eric looked around the camp, he realized that the 6 moor-crawlers looming over William were just the tip of the iceberg. The entire camp was surrounded. Everywhere that Eric looked, he saw another one of their empty, soulless, expressionless faces looming in the darkness. Luckily for him, right now they were all entirely captivated by William. What could he possibly even do right now? He turned around and looked over at Bonnie, who was fast asleep on the ground by the cart. Eric needed an escape plan of some kind here. Would Bonnie freak out if he woke her? She wasn't attached to the cart anymore, so Eric would have to reattach her before they could even think of somehow escaping this situation. Eric slowly stood up, getting up to his feet and looking around at the moor-crawlers anxiously. They were so focused on William that they were ignoring Eric completely. Eric held his breath nervously as he tiptoed his way through the moor-crawlers towards Bonnie. As soon as he neared her, she began to stir in her sleep. Eric placed a calming hand on her head and patted her soothingly. "Hey, girl. Everything's okay. Everything's fine," he whispered, praying that she'd somehow keep her composure around all of these moor-crawlers. When she first opened her eyes, she seemed a little discombobulated, exhaling with a small amount of panic. Immediately, a few of the moor-crawlers turned their heads to look directly at Eric and Bonnie. "Shh, shh, shh, shh," said Eric, rubbing her head soothingly as he looked around nervously at the curious moor-crawlers. "It's okay, girl. These are friends, said Eric, sweat beginning to pour down his anxious brow. Bonnie got up onto her knees and struggled to stand, still exhaling disconcertedly as she looked around the campsite at all of the strange creatures that had surrounded them. Eric continued to stroke her comfortingly as she stood up and shook her body. "Yeah, see? They're just normal, friendly people," said Eric, praying that she'd maintain her composure. As she hadn't yet begun to panic, he realized that this was his only chance to reattach her to the cart. "Come on, girl. That's a good girl," said Eric quietly. She was still fully harnessed, but she wasn't hitched to the cart. As he began hitching the cart back up to Bonnie, he watched William out of the corner of his eye. This was still the easy part. He didn't know how he was going to get William out of this. He just needed him to stay asleep for as long as possible before he could formulate a plan to get him out of here. "Let me out! Let me out!" shrieked Anne-Marie, shaking the wardrobe furiously and pounding on its doors from the inside. William was still kneeling down, clutching his head as the disturbing images continued. I can't!" cried William as tears began to pour from his eyes. "Let me out!" she continued to scream, pounding on every inch of the wardrobe. "It's locked!" exclaimed William, crawling towards the wardrobe and placing his palm against it. Suddenly the banging and screaming stopped. "You have the key," Anne-Marie whispered. William looked around his room. He couldn't see the key anywhere. I don't have it," said William tearfully. Suddenly, that's when he noticed it. There was a heavy object weighing down his right pocket. After rifling about in there for a moment, he finally found it and pulled it out. It was a giant brass key. "Anne-Marie, I've found it! I've got it!" said William excitedly. As dizzy as he was, William focused his mind as he lifted the giant brass key up towards the keyhole of the wardrobe. As it slid in, he suddenly felt another image burst into his mind. It was Anne-Marie on her funeral pyre. He couldn't see her, as she was covered by a white sheet, but he knew it was her under there. Her parents had confirmed it. He suddenly snapped back to reality. Anne-Marie was dead. "Let me out, William," she whispered. William let out a shaky breath and closed his eyes. Anne-Marie wasn't dead. That was impossible. She was locked in his wardrobe. She wasn't dead. She was right here. His parents couldn't be dead either. That made no sense. And with that, he turned the key, feeling the quintessential dull clunk of the mechanism unlatching. He'd done it. The door was unlocked. Eric hastily managed to clip the last of the buckles on Bonnie's harness, but suddenly she began to panic a little. She was staring straight towards William. Eric placed a comforting hand on her head, turning to see what was suddenly riling her up. As soon as he cast his eyes upon William, his jaw dropped in shock. William was slowly beginning to hover upwards above the ground. His hair was floating about as though he was underwater, and a dull red glow was being emitted all around his body. The moor crawlers were becoming agitated, slowly moving away anxiously from William. Eric had to do something fast. Whatever was happening to William was threatening to cause the entire camp to explode into chaos. He looked around at the moor crawlers who were all starting to twitch uncomfortably. Eric let out a quiet moan of discomfort when he realized what he was going to have to do. He needed to work his way right into the middle of the pack if he wanted to wake William up. As he began turning Bonnie and the cart around for but a moment, the thought of simply hopping up into the cart and disappearing into the night crossed his mind. Eric shook his head and turned back, taking a determined step towards William. Just as he began to move, suddenly a black mist started erupting from William's mouth. His body twitched and twisted in the air, flipping around so that his chest was facing upwards. There was a white light burning beneath his skin, exposing every vein in his body as he lifted upwards into the sky. The moor crawlers' signature dull, vacant, soul-dead expression that they all had always worn suddenly began to change. Their brows furrowed, and their dull eye sockets darkened, their faces beginning to twitch sporadically as their expressions twisted. Some of them began releasing a disgusting, throaty growl as their bodies pulsated as though energized by something. Bonnie was becoming extremely restless, taking a few panicked steps away from the camp and taking the cart with her. Eric had to act now. Just as he was about to snap into action, a gypsy suddenly emerged from her tent. As soon as she emerged, she froze for a moment, taking in the horrific scene before her. Immediately she let out a heart-chilling shriek of horror as she beheld the terrifying monstrosities that had infested their camp. Every single moor crawler's head snapped around to stare at her, their faces twisted into an expression of malicious fury and hatred. She stopped screaming, realizing that she'd drawn the attention of every single moor crawler, but she was too late. The moor crawlers released a disgusting guttural war cry, the likes of which Eric had never heard in his life. Immediately, every single moor crawler in the camp charged towards her. Eric had no time to waste. He couldn't save her, but this was the only opening he was going to get to grab William. He ran as fast as his legs would carry him into the middle of the camp, while the woman shrieked in terror, continuing to attract the attention of the moor crawlers. As the moor crawlers reached her tent, her screams began to wake the other gypsies, who all began to emerge from their tents too. Eric grabbed William, who was still floating ominously in the air, and tried to pull him down to the ground, but he couldn't overpower whatever force was keeping him there. "William! William! Wake up!" screamed Eric, shaking him desperately. The gypsy woman's tent was torn open by the voracious moor crawlers who descended upon her, ripping and tearing at every inch of her body with their enormous human-like arms. She screamed and gargled her final cries as the monsters tore her to shreds. The other gypsies were beginning to emerge from their tents, some holding weaponry and some simply screaming in horror as they beheld the horrific sight outside. "Come on, William! Snap out of it! I need you to come back to me!" pleaded Eric desperately. Chapter 18. The Dance of the Gypsies. The moment that the key rotated in the lock, the doors of the wardrobe burst open, knocking William backwards onto the floor. He couldn't see what was inside, but he felt a horrifying chill running down his spine. Whatever was in there, it wasn't Anne-Marie. He could feel its presence. It was something dark, something evil. As William watched on in horror, a thick red fog burst out of the wardrobe and started filling the room. It seemed to have energy pulsing all through it like a thundercloud. William gasped in horror, scrambling away from the wardrobe as the red fog pulsated unnaturally around his room. After a moment, it suddenly focused itself inwards, shooting down towards William's open mouth. Before he could even figure out what was going on, the red smog was working its way down his throat and filling his lungs. William's eyes opened wide with fear as he tried his hardest to close his mouth, but couldn't. As the red fog was filling his body, his vision began to fade, and he felt his eyes lulling shut as he slowly lost consciousness. Suddenly, a sound reverberated in his mind. It was a sound that he clung to for dear life. It felt like he was drowning, and it was his only hope of surfacing. "William! William! Wake up!" screamed Eric desperately. William focused all of his willpower on opening his eyes. "Come on, William! Snap out of it! I need you to come back to me!" screamed Eric's voice desperately. Eric needed him. None of this was real. He was in a nightmare, and it was time for him to wake up. William snapped his mouth closed, stopping the red mist in its tracks as a horrific shriek erupted throughout the entire dream world he was in. It shook the very walls of his room with its fury. William didn't care. He wasn't going to let this continue. He needed to get back to Eric. He slowly struggled back to his feet as the furious shrieking continued, blasting the windows of the room out and causing the walls to begin to splinter and crack. As William struggled his way back towards the wardrobe where the red fog was still escaping from, he could feel the smoke pushing against him, trying to keep him back. He wasn't going to let it. Eric needed him. He needed to wake up. He could feel in his heart that there was only one way for him to do that. With a final war cry of his own, William charged at the wardrobe door like he was trying to break it down, finally managing to barge his way through the red mist and begin closing the door. Again, the gargled shrieking intensified, the entire world shaking like there was a hurricane and an earthquake all at once. The walls of his room were blasted to pieces, sending splinters of wood flying all around him in a vortex as he pushed against the wardrobe door with all his might. Both William and the dark presence screamed as they worked against each other, with William trying to close the door and the presence trying to open it. With one final overpowering push, William managed to slam the door shut before reaching down to the floor where he'd dropped the key when he'd fallen. The shrieking intensified as the wardrobe was smashed against from the inside. It was being attacked so forcibly that the wardrobe was bouncing on the floor as the monster within banged against every inch of its walls, trying to get out. William leant his back against the door, which was springing open slightly with every desperate pound from the monster. He slowly slid down until he could reach the key on the floor. As soon as he felt it in his grasp, he slid his way back up, turned around and gave the wardrobe door one last firm push shut before ramming the key into the keyhole and twisting it forcibly. The monster inside released another furious scream, followed by a torrent of indecipherable garbled words being hurled at him from within. It slammed desperately at the wardrobe doors, hard enough that the entire wardrobe moved around on the floor. "William!" exclaimed Eric's voice again, pulling at William's psyche. He felt this nightmare world beginning to fade away. It was finally time to wake up. As soon as William opened his eyes, he saw Eric's panicked face looking down over him. Suddenly the reality of their situation hit William as the symphony of screams and violence set in. He looked in horror at the scene around them as tents and gypsies were being torn apart by the moor-crawlers. He looked back up at Eric, who seemed to have caught him in mid-air. "William, come on!" shouted Eric, standing him on the ground, then grabbing him by the arm and pulling him towards their cart. Bonnie was already part way down the hill, fearfully whinnying as the horrors of the camp intensified. She was in a combat of her own, rearing up on her front 2 legs as a moor-crawler lunged at her. "What's going on here?" gasped William in terror as he narrowly dodged a moor-crawler that went skittering past him towards a gypsy who had shot it with a crossbow. It dived on the man, shoving a thumb into each of his eye sockets and wrenching at his face, cracking his skull and tearing his face in half while its other arms disemboweled him. William cried out in fear as Eric dragged him through the carnage towards Bonnie. "Watch out!" exclaimed William, pulling Eric back from a moor-crawler that had launched itself at him. The two narrowly missed the creature, falling backwards down onto the ground. William immediately felt an explosion of searing pain emitting from his wound, but he had no time to lament. They immediately picked their pace back up and sprinted towards Bonnie. As soon as they neared the cart, the 2 boys jumped onto it for dear life. As they dangled from the back of the cart, Bonnie finally seemed to get the best of the moor-crawler that was lunging at her. As it jumped up at her, she kicked it in the face with both of her front hooves and sent it falling onto its back. As soon as it was down, she broke into a sprint, trampling the thing and carrying their cart with her. As their cart bumped roughly over the fallen moor-crawler, William was tossed up into the back of the cart. The moor-crawler, which the boys had narrowly dodged, was still after them, though, diving onto Eric and grabbing a hold of his legs from behind the cart. "Eric!" screamed William, clambering to the back of the moving cart to grab a hold of Eric's arms. As Eric continued to dangle, dragging the moor-crawler along the ground behind them, he looked up at William. For the first time in his life, William saw Eric's face holding an expression of pure, unadulterated terror as he looked into his eyes. "Hold on, Eric! No matter what, hold on!" exclaimed William. Eric cried out in pain as the moor-crawler's grip on his legs intensified as it tried to drag itself up his body and into the cart. William pulled at Eric's torso, working with him to heave him upwards closer onto the cart, which was now moving much faster as Bonnie broke into a full gallop. The moor-crawler, which was being dragged behind the cart, worked its way further up Eric's body, grabbing onto the sides of his torso with its front hands and releasing a blood-churning, guttural cry. William wasted no time, jumping over the back of the wagon and kicking at its face desperately. Every time he struck its face, the thing seemed to just get angrier as it was unable to release its front pair of hands from Eric to fight back without falling. William released one final cry, kicking into the side of its face as hard as he could, finally causing it to lose its grip and go tumbling backwards into the moors. William grabbed hold of Eric, pulling him up into the back of the cart before again falling onto his back, causing him to cry out in agony. He rolled around onto his side, catching his breath for a moment. Eric lay on his belly, also recouping himself, before suddenly snapping back into action. He shot back up onto his hands and knees, trying to keep himself balanced in the back of the cart that was still blasting its way through the bumpy countryside. He grabbed hold of Bonnie's reins and began trying to steer her back towards the main road through the moors. She was still in a desperate panic, and so she was incredibly hard to direct. But after a few moments, Eric managed to regain control. He He guided her down the hill and back onto the main road, looking over his shoulder fearfully towards the campsite in their wake. William, struggling to his feet, immediately felt his heart fill with panic again. He could see countless more crawlers still chasing after them in the darkness, with that twisted expression of fury plastered across all of their faces. "Don't slow down!" yelled William as he watched the six-armed creatures failing to keep up with their cart now that they were on a flat road. After several minutes of charging through the night, the many more crawlers had been left behind in the darkness. As Bonnie began to slow down a little, William finally let himself take a deep breath. He had no idea what had happened at that camp while he was asleep, but he'd never seen creatures as terrifying as those which they'd just encountered. He climbed over from the back of the cart onto the seat beside Eric and placed a concerned hand over his shoulder. "Eric, are ye okay?" asked William, still shaking with shock and adrenaline, but suddenly realizing that Eric was bleeding. "Eric!" exclaimed William, lifting his tunic to assess his wounds. "I'm fine," said Eric with a dark expression on his face. They'd just been through what was certainly Eric's most harrowing experience yet. William could tell that Eric was far from fine. He decided to give him a few more moments to calm down before he tried talking to him again. The two rumbled along in silence as William caught his breath for a short while. "What were those things?" asked William, breaking the silence after a few minutes of quiet travel. "More crawlers," replied Eric quietly. William turned and looked at him quizzically. "Those were more crawlers?" asked William in shock. Aside from having 6 arms, they didn't match Eric's descriptions at all. Rather than the dull, solitary, lumbering animals he'd made them out to be, they were fast, vicious, and clearly operating as a pack. Their faces and limbs were also oddly human-like. This was not what William had been envisioning based on Eric's descriptions. "William, I need you to be honest with me," said Eric suddenly. "That thing," he began. "It's still inside of you, isn't it?" asked Eric, continuing to simply stare straight ahead. William nodded. "Aye," he responded quietly. There was a long silence before William decided to speak again. "Eric," began William, turning to face his friend before he suddenly noticed that Eric was crying. "Hey!" he exclaimed, putting a concerned hand on Eric's shoulder. Eric shook his head and wiped at his tears. "Can we just not talk for a while?" asked Eric. William nodded understandingly. As the two of them rode on in silence, dawn was beginning to break over the horizon. They'd barely even managed to spend a single night in that gypsy camp before it had fallen into chaos and horror. The night had taken its toll on the boys, but their troubles were far from over. The 3 knights sat in awkward silence, staring across the mahogany desk at the Chancellor, who was still reading over the paperwork with a puzzled expression on his face. August and Azalea shared an uncomfortable glance with one another as the deafening stillness loomed over the room. A guard cleared his throat, breaking the silence and drawing the attention of all 3 knights. Flustered, he immediately bowed apologetically. "I'm confused by this part here. Would you please explain to me again why you travelled to Mistfall?" asked the Chancellor, looking up from the paperwork for the first time in minutes. Ivar took a nervous sip from his goblet, drawing the ire of his compatriots as they were plunged into having to explain the situation that he'd gotten them into. "Well, you see," began Azalea, clearing her throat and sitting up straighter in her chair. "The cleric requested it, sir," piped up Ivar suddenly. Azalea stared at him in surprise. The Chancellor raised his eyebrows. "The cleric did?" he confirmed, looking between the 3 of them in confusion. "Ah, yes," began Ivar, his voice cracking as he choked on the wine he'd not yet finished swallowing. As Ivar broke into a subdued coughing fit, Azalea sat back in her chair, scowling at him resentfully. "Yes, sir. It was Father Marcus himself who fondly recalled the hot springs he had dearly loved when he was a child. Lied Ivar. Azalea shook her head and rubbed her eyes in disdain at the needless, fictitious details Ivar had added. Father Marcus, whom, as you all say, was rendered unable to communicate effectively due to a particularly acute case of gateway sickness, asked the Chancellor, turning his head to look at the physician who was standing up among a cohort of relevant individuals. Yes, that is correct, sir," replied the physician, clearly feeling out of place in this awkward meeting. The Chancellor looked around at each of the knights again with an eyebrow raised. "Can you understand why I am confused?" he asked expectantly. The three knights nodded their heads empathetically. The Chancellor leaned back in his chair and let out a sigh. "After all that the three of you have accomplished, I must say that I am shocked. A simple escort to and from a country town, barely a few days' journey from Oxgate, and this is the task three heads of knightly orders found too difficult to carry out," asked the Chancellor in frustration. All three knights hung their heads in shame. "Each of you are in line to become knight commanders, are you not?" he asked in frustration. Again the three knights simply nodded. "And? Do you honestly feel that this is an appropriate title for you at this point?" asked the Chancellor animatedly. All three knights snapped their heads up to look at him in concern. "Sir, if I may, he really was very difficult to work with and—" began Sir Ivar, before suddenly he was interrupted. "Difficult to work with? Are you telling me that three first-class knights can't keep a single sickly cleric alive for a single week just because he—" Midway through his sentence, the Chancellor stopped as though he'd bitten his tongue. He was looking over the knight's shoulders with an expression of surprise on his face. He hopped up to his feet and bowed his head politely. The three knights looked over their shoulders, only to see that the Duke himself had entered the room. The three knights instantly stood up and bowed their heads politely. "Your Grace!" exclaimed the Chancellor. "Good morning," said the Duke politely. As the whole room struggled to regain their composure, he walked over towards the large mahogany desk and gestured towards one of the chairs on the side of the room. Immediately one of the guards carried it over for him, and he sat down at the side of the desk, looking over the paperwork curiously. "Please continue," said the Duke distractedly as he read the paperwork. The three knights shared worried glances with one another. "Ahem, as I was, saying," stammered the Chancellor, trying to adjust to their new company. He stared blankly at the three knights as he tried to recall where he had left off. "Oh yes, knight commanders. I must say I do not foresee a promotion to such a role in any of your near futures," admitted the Chancellor, shaking his head and glancing at the Duke for approval. But sir, if you just—" began Ivar. "What is this?" asked the Duke, shifting his gaze up from the paper in confusion. All four members of the meeting exchanged fearful glances. "The way this is worded is rather peculiar. What does this mean?" asked the Duke, pointing to a line of text. "That means that he, dismembered his own genitals, Your Grace," stammered the Chancellor, unsure of how to politely phrase it. "The man castrated himself?" asked the Duke in shock. All three knights hung their heads in shame once more. "Yes, Your Grace," confirmed the Chancellor, averting his eyes awkwardly. The Duke screwed up his face and looked at the knights in disbelief. He stared at them for a moment before shaking his head angrily. "Three first-class knights," said the Duke, holding up three fingers and looking at the three of them expectantly. The three knights blushed. "Actually, Your Grace, technically they're knight officers," added the Chancellor. The Duke raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Three knight officers, no less," he confirmed, again causing the three knights to hang their heads even lower. The Duke put down the paperwork and rubbed his face in frustration. Why were 3 night officers sent to escort a single cleric on respite in the first place? Asked the Duke, raising an eyebrow and turning to face the Chancellor. The Chancellor sat up straight in his chair and cleared his throat, caught off guard by the Duke's focus suddenly shifting onto him. Well, you see, Your Grace, the first college semester didn't begin until the following month, and these knights are in line to become commanders. They requested being sent on a quest of some importance while they had free time to boost their renown and such, stammered the Chancellor, realizing that he too could come under fire in this conversation. So you're telling me the Treasurer approved this too? Asked the Duke in surprise. Yes, Your Grace. We saw it as the best use of their time, considering the amount of exposure and approval the cleric himself was getting from the towns that he travelled through. We considered it important to show that we shared the values of the people and— The Chancellor tried to explain before the Duke held up his hand for him to stop. You didn't show that we shared the values of the people. You showed that the dissidents are right in questioning where their taxes are going, yelled the Duke angrily, slamming his hand down on the desk in frustration, causing a few of the Chancellor's expensive desktop trinkets to topple over. The Chancellor gulped anxiously as the 3 knights stayed silent. I must admit, how 3 knights could let a cleric do this to himself, began the Duke, gesturing towards the paperwork with an expression of disgust, is beyond me, but— The Duke suddenly stopped and turned around to look at the out-of-place cohort of individuals standing around the sides of the room. Who are all of these people? He asked abruptly. They're peripherally related to the situation, Your Grace, stammered the Chancellor. The Duke turned back around and looked at him quizzically. Peripherally? He asked in confusion. The Chancellor simply nodded and swallowed anxiously. The Duke closed his eyes in frustration. Out! All of you! Get out! Now! He demanded, pointing towards the door. Everybody bowed before hurriedly taking their leave and closing the door behind them. The Duke turned back to the table. Do you have any idea what kind of ire the common folk are holding towards the college right now? Asked the Duke, looking between the 4 of them expectantly. Your Grace, if I may, began the Chancellor, before being silenced by the Duke's hand once again. I've been in discussions with the royals themselves over how concerned we all are about the rumours that taxpayer money is being squandered on the college. Now you've gone and made a big show of sending 3 night officers on a pointless escort mission of an invalid to a pile of mud in the moors. That would have been bad enough on its own, but then they somehow failed at the task too, yelled the Duke, again slamming his fist on the desk angrily. The Chancellor managed to catch a small golden pheasant statuette before it fell off onto the floor, while the 3 knights again hung their heads in shame. I mean, perhaps we are as ridiculous as those Southerners say we are, said the Duke with a sigh, leaning back in his chair and shaking his head as he watched the Chancellor sheepishly trying to right his toppled trinkets. When he realized he was being watched, he stopped and retracted his hands back down into his lap and cleared his throat daintily. Well, unlike them, at least we actually have a Knights' College, said the Chancellor, raising an eyebrow as he was clearly thinking spitefully about the Castilian kingdom to the south. The Duke looked at the Chancellor in disbelief. Should we really be so proud of that? The gateway has been closed for over a century now, Chancellor. What are we even doing here? If this is the quality of the knights our kingdom is producing, then perhaps they're right in investing their money into their military instead, shouted the Duke, gesturing towards the 3 silent knights once again. The 3 knights exchanged glances, each wanting to defend themselves but being too wise to do so. I'm lucky my aide keeps an eye on your schedule, or I'd have never even known about any of this. Why did this meeting take you months to arrange? Asked the Duke suddenly, turning his ire directly upon the Chancellor. He squirmed in his chair for a moment, gaping like a cod as he looked around searchingly at the 3 knights for somebody to blame. Well, I wanted to afford the knights some time to write up an effective report, considering the importance of the situation. Since the semester had begun, these three were obviously quite inundated with work in the college, so I decided to give them until the mid-year break, stammered the Chancellor. In reality, his provision of so much time to write their report had come out of his own inability to recognize its importance more than out of any kind of charity from the man. After a moment of awkward silence, as the Duke processed the Chancellor's shallow excuses, he let out another disappointed sigh and stood up. "You know what? You deal with it," he said suddenly, shrugging emphatically. The four of them exchanged dumbfounded looks. "The four of you are to solve this problem," said the Duke, taking a few steps towards the door of the room. But, Your Grace," began the Chancellor, standing from his chair. Again, the Duke held up his hand. "How can the college win back the hearts of those who doubt its value? How can we assure the taxpayers that the college is worthy of the taxes it receives from them? I must admit, at this point, even I am among them," said the Duke, holding his hand up preemptively as the four of them all wanted to ask for clarification. "After such a monumental failure from all of you, this is the least you could do to atone for it. I expect a solution within the week. If you are unable to do so, I'll strip you all back to the rank of mere squires. Do you understand me?" threatened the Duke commandingly. The three knights nodded understandingly, while the Chancellor stared back nervously. The Duke turned to leave again before August suddenly piped up with a question. "Your Grace, the Chancellor is not a knight. The role of squire would—" began August before being interrupted by the Chancellor, shushing him and kicking his leg under the desk. "Ah, yes," said the Duke, turning back around and assessing the nervous Chancellor intensely. "I'll have to decide on your punishment, but I promise that you won't like it. That'll be all," said the Duke before turning back and leaving the room. After he'd left, a heavy silence fell over them all, as each of the four quietly felt the weight of the burden the Duke had dropped on their shoulders. "Well, there's somewhere else I need to be, so—" began Ivar, standing up before Azalea grabbed his arm and pulled him back down. The Chancellor stared at Ivar furiously. "Well, I suppose we'd better start brainstorming then," said Sir August, leaning forward in his chair and scratching his chin, deep in thought. As the weight of the responsibility that had just been passed down to them found its grip around their hearts, the four silently pondered how they could possibly achieve what the Duke and the royals could not.